from a Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ, I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written,
he was just a prophet.
No, we don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
Ben Shapiro presents a historically flawed and narrow view of who Jesus truly was. He argues that Jesus was nothing more than a Jewish man who attempted to lead a rebellion against Roman rule, only to be crucified like any other criminal. Shapiro rejects the idea of Jesus as a prophet or the divine Son of God who sacrificed himself for humanity's sins. In this interview, Shapiro sits down with Dr. William Lane Craig, a renowned Christian apologist with extensive academic credentials in philosophy and theology, to discuss the true nature of Jesus. What happens next is shocking. Shapiro is left speechless by Dr. Craig's compelling arguments. I'll play the exchange and share my thoughts at the end.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the gospel?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth.
Ben Shapiro, an intelligent and well-respected commentator, presents a perspective that is common in modern Judaism, but historically controversial. He argues that Jesus was neither divine nor a prophet, but rather a Jewish revolutionary who attempted to overthrow Roman rule and was executed like many others before him. This view, however, has a significant flaw. If Jesus was merely another revolutionary, why did his disciples persist in worshiping him even after his brutal death? Why would they suffer persecution and martyrdom for a failed rebellion? These are the questions that Dr. William Lane Craig brings to the forefront. Dr. Craig refutes Shapiro's claim by going straight to the words of Jesus himself. When we examine the historically credible statements of Jesus, we see that he did not present himself as a political leader. Instead, he made radical claims that set him apart from any other figure in Jewish history. Dr. Craig highlights that Jesus referred to himself as the Messiah, the Son of God, and the Son of Man, titles with profound theological implications. In Mark 15, during his trial before the Sanhedrin, Jesus explicitly confirms his identity when asked if he is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. His response, "I am." This declaration caused the high priest to tear his robes in horror, condemning Jesus for blasphemy. This is crucial. Declaring oneself as the Messiah alone was not punishable by death under Jewish law. However, Jesus claimed something far greater. He claimed divine authority, placing himself at the right hand of God. This was why he was sentenced to death, not because he led a political revolt. Now, this is where Dr. Craig delivers the knockout argument, the resurrection. He explains that Jesus' resurrection is God's way of proving that Jesus was who he claimed to be. If Jesus had merely been a political figure, his execution would have been the end of the story. But something happened that changed everything. Dr. Craig presents 3 historical facts accepted by most scholars, regardless of their beliefs. The empty tomb. Jesus' tomb was found empty by his female followers. This fact is reported in at least 6 independent sources. Post-resurrection appearances. Multiple individuals and groups, including skeptics, reported seeing Jesus alive after his death. The birth of Christianity. The disciples, who once feared for their lives, suddenly and sincerely believed in the risen Christ, willing to die for this truth. If the resurrection is true, it confirms Jesus' claims. It means he wasn't just a teacher, a prophet, or a failed revolutionary. He was and is the Son of God. After hearing Dr. Craig's compelling defense, Ben Shapiro doesn't refute the argument. He simply finds it uninteresting. But why? Is it possible that the sheer weight of historical evidence left him with little to say? Christianity isn't based on blind faith. It is rooted in real, historical events that withstand scholarly scrutiny. Dr. Craig's argument highlights why Jesus' resurrection is the foundation of Christian belief. It is the ultimate evidence of his divine nature. So, what does this mean for us today? It means that Jesus is who he said he was. The tomb is empty. The resurrection is real. And the hope of eternal life is available to everyone who places their faith in Christ. If you've ever doubted, if you've ever wondered who Jesus truly is, I invite you to examine the evidence for yourself. Jesus didn't just die, he rose again, and he offers you the gift of salvation. Will you accept it? If this video strengthened your faith or gave you something to think about, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, Jesus is Lord, now and forever. God bless you.